Staff Sergeant Daniel Morrison had been walking the streets of London for 3 days without sleep. His military uniform was wrinkled and stained, his boots scuffed from endless wandering through the city's maze of streets. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of a man who had reached his breaking point. Though few people who passed him on the sidewalks could have guessed the depth of his desperation, Daniel had served his country for 12 years, completing 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. He'd received commendations for bravery, saved the lives of his fellow soldiers, and carried out missions that would never be discussed in public. But none of that seemed to matter now, as he stood outside the imposing gates of Buckingham Palace, staring at the red-coated guards who stood at attention like living statues. The morning air was crisp, typical for early October in London. Tourists gathered around the palace gates, taking photographs and chatting excitedly about catching a glimpse of royalty. Double-decker buses rumbled past on the busy street, their passengers pressing faces against windows to get better views of the famous landmark. Daniel barely noticed any of it. His mind was trapped in a loop of recent events that had shattered his world. 2 weeks earlier, he had returned from his final deployment to find his wife had left him, taking their 8-year-old daughter Emma with her. The divorce papers were waiting on the kitchen table of their empty house, along with a note explaining that she couldn't handle the stress of military life anymore. The same day, Daniel had received notification that his disability claim for post-traumatic stress disorder had been denied. Despite documented evidence of his psychological struggles, bureaucrats had determined that his condition wasn't service-connected. The monthly payments he had counted on to help rebuild his life would never come. Within a week, the bank had begun foreclosure proceedings on his house. His savings account, depleted by legal fees and his wife's departure, couldn't cover the mortgage payments. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed to protect, was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Daniel had tried to follow proper channels. He had visited government offices, filled out countless forms, and sat through meetings with officials who spoke in bureaucratic language that made no sense. Each conversation ended the same way, the promises to look into his situation that never led to actual help. His former commanding officer had been sympathetic, but powerless to intervene in civilian matters. Fellow veterans had shared their own horror stories of navigating the system, offering advice that led nowhere and support that couldn't pay bills or bring back his family, as Daniel stood outside Buckingham Palace, watching the guards in there. Distinctive red tunics and tall black hats, he felt a desperate idea forming in his mind. These men served the same crown he had sworn to defend during his years in the British Army. They understood duty, sacrifice, and honor in ways that civilian bureaucrats never could. The Royal Guards were symbols of everything Daniel had believed in during his military career. They represented tradition, loyalty, and unwavering commitment to service. Perhaps they would understand his situation when no one else would. Perhaps they could help him find a way forward when all other options had been exhausted. Daniel had heard stories about people who had gained access to Buckingham Palace over the years, security breaches that had made headlines, individuals who had somehow managed to get past multiple layers of protection to reach the royal residence itself. He didn't want to cause harm or create chaos, simply wanted someone in authority to listen to his story and provide the help he desperately needed. The tourists around him continued their sightseeing, unaware of the internal struggle taking place just a few feet away. Children pressed their faces against the palace railings, pointing excitedly at the guards. Parents took photographs, creating memories of their London vacation. Life continued normally for everyone except Daniel, whose world had collapsed around him. He thought about his daughter Emma, who was now living with her mother in a different city. She didn't understand why Daddy couldn't come home anymore, why their family had been torn apart by forces beyond a child's comprehension. Daniel's heart ached as he remembered her last words to him. "When are you coming to get me, Daddy?" The weight of his service weapon, still legally carried due to his military status, pressed against his side as a constant reminder of his training and capabilities. Daniel had no intention of using it to harm anyone, but its presence gave him confidence that he could navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. As the morning wore on, Daniel studied the palace's perimeter, noting the positions of guards, security, cameras, and potential entry points. His military training automatically assessed the defensive arrangements, identifying weaknesses that a determined individual might exploit. The main gates were heavily fortified and constantly monitored. Daniel noticed areas where the palace grounds were less obviously protected. Side entrances used by staff and service vehicles offered possibilities for someone who understood tactical movement and timing. A group of guards changed shifts with ceremonial precision, their movements choreographed by centuries of tradition. Daniel watched the ritual with professional interest. Recognizing the discipline and training required to maintain such standards, these were serious soldiers, not just ceremonial figures, and they deserved his respect even as he planned to circumvent their security. The palace itself rose majestically behind its gates, symbol of British power and tradition that had endured through wars, social upheaval, and political changes. For Daniel, it represented something else, a last hope for justice and recognition of his service and sacrifice. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the palace courtyard, Daniel made his decision. He would find a way inside, not to cause harm or seek revenge, but to demand the attention and respect that had been denied to him through official channels. He would make them listen to the story of a soldier who had given everything for his country and received nothing in return. The royal guards, their proud traditions and commitment to duty, would surely understand his situation. He would see past the desperate circumstances to recognize a fellow warrior who needed help. At least that was what Daniel hoped, as he prepared to take the most dramatic action of his life. Guardsman Thomas Fletcher had been standing at his post for nearly 2 hours when he first noticed the man in the military uniform lingering outside the palace gates. Fletcher's trained eye automatically cataloged details: British Army insignia, staff sergeant rank, combat boots that had seen real action, and most concerning of all, the unmistakable posture of someone carrying concealed weapons. Fletcher had served with the Grenadier Guards for 6 years. And before that, he had completed 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Parachute Regiment. He knew the difference between curious tourists and potential threats. This man fell into neither category. He was something else entirely, a fellow soldier who seemed to be studying the palace defenses with professional interest. The afternoon shift change was approaching, and Fletcher would soon be relieved by Guardsman Davies. Protocol required him to report any suspicious activity to his superiors, but something about the man's bearing made Fletcher hesitate. There was no aggression in his stance, no signs of immediate threat. Instead, Fletcher saw something he recognized from his own experiences in combat zones: the look of a soldier who had reached his limit through his peripheral vision. Fletcher watched as the man moved slowly along the palace perimeter. His movements were careful and deliberate, showing the tactical awareness that came from years of military training. Most civilians walked past the palace guards without really seeing them, treating them as tourist attractions rather than active soldiers. This man was different. He was studying them as fellow professionals. Fletcher's earpiece crackled with routine communications between security personnel. The palace operated under multiple layers of protection from the visible guards like himself. 2 armed police officers, plainclothes security agents, and sophisticated surveillance systems. Breaking into Buckingham Palace wasn't impossible, but it required either exceptional luck or professional-level planning. The man in the military uniform disappeared from Fletcher's field of view as he moved toward the eastern side of the palace grounds. Fletcher couldn't turn his head to follow without breaking protocol, but his training allowed him to maintain awareness of the overall security situation through sound and peripheral vision. 20 minutes later, alarms began sounding. Inside the palace, Fletcher heard the distinctive tone that indicated a perimeter breach, followed by rapid radio chatter as security teams coordinated their response. His own position prevented him from participating in the immediate response, but he could hear running footsteps and shouted commands coming from various directions. "All stations, we have an intruder in the East Wing Gardens," came the voice through Fletcher's earpiece. "Subject is a military-aged male in British Army uniform. Exercise extreme caution." Fletcher felt his pulse quicken. He had been right about the man outside the gates. Somehow the stranger had managed to penetrate the palace's outer defenses and was now somewhere inside the royal residence itself. The next few minutes brought a flurry of activity as security forces mobilized throughout the palace complex. Fletcher remained at his post, maintaining the ceremonial calm that was expected of the Queen's Guard, even during emergencies. Tourists outside the gates had no idea that anything unusual was happening, though some began to notice the subtle increase in activity around the palace perimeter. "Subject has been located in the Rose Garden," the voice in Fletcher's earpiece reported. "He's not attempting to flee or hide, just sitting on a bench. Armed response team is moving to intercept." Fletcher wished he could see what was happening. The Rose Garden was on the opposite side of the palace from his position, but he knew it well from his own patrols during off-duty hours. It was a peaceful spot, carefully maintained and rarely visited by anyone except royal family members and senior staff. "Armed response team in position," came another voice. "Subject appears to be unarmed, but may have weapons concealed under his uniform. He's not responding to verbal commands." Fletcher understood the delicate nature of the situation. Palace security had to assume the worst-case scenario while hoping for the best possible outcome. The intruder could be a terrorist, an assassin, or simply someone having a mental health crisis. There was no way to know without getting close enough to assess the threat properly. "This is Inspector Morrison," a new voice announced through the radio system. "I'm approaching the subject for direct contact. All units maintain positions but do not engage unless I give specific orders." Inspector Morrison was the senior security officer for the palace, a veteran of both military service and law enforcement, who had handled similar situations before. Fletcher had worked with him during previous security incidents and respected his judgment under pressure. "Subject, this is Inspector Morrison of the Metropolitan Police. You need to identify yourself and explain your presence on palace grounds." Through his earpiece, Fletcher could hear Morrison's voice echoing across the Rose Garden as he spoke directly to the intruder. The response came back clearly enough for Fletcher to understand the man's words. "Staff Sergeant Daniel Morrison, 3rd Battalion, Yorkshire Regiment. I need to speak with someone who understands military service." The surname was a coincidence that might help establish rapport between the inspector and the intruder. More importantly, the man had identified himself clearly and made a specific request rather than issuing demands or threats. "Sergeant Morrison, I'm a former military officer myself," Inspector Morrison responded. "I understand you're upset about something, but breaking into Buckingham Palace isn't the way to solve your problems. We need you to surrender any weapons you might be carrying and come with us peacefully." Fletcher heard a long pause before the intruder responded. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I just need someone to listen. The system failed me, and I don't know where else to turn." The desperation in the man's voice was audible even through the radio transmission. Fletcher had heard similar tones from soldiers in his unit who had struggled with the transition back to civilian life. Post-traumatic stress, family problems, financial difficulties, and bureaucratic obstacles had driven many good men to desperate actions. "We can talk, Sergeant," Inspector Morrison said. "But first, I need you to show me your hands and tell me if you're carrying any weapons." "Service pistol on my right hip," Daniel Morrison replied. "Standard issue, fully loaded." "I'm not reaching for it." The admission confirmed Fletcher's earlier assessment. The intruder was armed and potentially dangerous, but his willingness to identify his weapon suggested he wasn't planning to use it aggressively. "Armed response team, subject has confirmed he's carrying a loaded weapon," Inspector Morrison transmitted. "Snipers, do you have clear shots if needed?" "Affirmative, sir. There's multiple clear angles available." Fletcher knew that several highly trained marksmen were now positioned around the Rose Garden, ready to neutralize the threat if Daniel Morrison made any aggressive moves. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, with one wrong decision potentially leading to tragedy. "Sergeant Morrison," Inspector Morrison continued, "I want to hear your story. But first, I need you to very slowly remove your weapon and place it on the ground beside the bench. Can you do that for me?" The radio fell silent as everyone waited for the intruder's response. Fletcher found himself holding his breath, hoping that a fellow soldier would make the right choice and avoid a confrontation that could only end badly. Daniel Morrison sat perfectly still on the marble bench in the Rose Garden, surrounded by the most beautiful flowers he had seen in years. The irony wasn't lost on him that in his darkest moment, he found himself in one of the most peaceful places. In London, the sound of Inspector Morrison's voice echoed off the garden walls, calm but firm, requesting that he surrender his weapon. "I understand what you're asking," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet garden. "But if I give up my weapon, I become just another powerless veteran that everyone can ignore." Ooh, through the radio communications he could hear around him, Daniel knew he was surrounded by armed officers, snipers, and security personnel. He had expected this response, but the reality was more intimidating than he had imagined. Still, he felt strangely calm, as if finally taking action had lifted a weight from his shoulders. "Sergeant Morrison," Inspector Morrison said, taking a step closer, "keeping that weapon isn't giving you power. It's putting you in danger. These officers around us are trained professionals, just like you. They don't want to hurt you, but they have a job to do." Daniel looked around the garden, noting the tactical positions he could observe. Professional respect for the security team's deployment mixed with sadness that his fellow soldiers were now his potential enemies. "Inspector, may I ask about your military service?" Daniel asked, buying time while he considered his options. "Royal Marines, 15 years, one in Northern Ireland, one in the Falklands. I understand what it's like to serve your country, and then struggle to find your place afterward." The admission created a connection Daniel hadn't expected. Here was someone who truly might understand his situation, someone who had faced similar challenges transitioning from military to civilian life. "Then you know what it's like to give everything for your country and get nothing back?" Daniel said, his voice beginning to crack with emotion. "You know what it's like to watch bureaucrats deny your claims while your life falls apart?" Inspector Morrison moved another step closer, his own weapon holstered and his hands visible. "I do know, Sergeant. I spent 2 years fighting the system for my own disability benefits. I understand the frustration, the anger, the feeling that no one cares about what you've sacrificed." Across the palace complex, Guardsman Fletcher listened to the conversation through his earpiece while maintaining his ceremonial post. The exchange between the two men resonated with his own experiences and those of soldiers he had served with. Mental health struggles, family breakdowns, and bureaucratic obstacles were common themes in military communities.
"Oh, damn,"
Sir Daniel said, addressing Inspector Morrison with the respect due to a senior officer. "My 8-year-old daughter doesn't understand why Daddy can't come home anymore. My wife left because she couldn't handle the stress of not knowing if I'd come back from each deployment. The government denied my disability claim, and now I'm losing my house." The pain in Daniel's voice was raw and genuine. Inspector Morrison had heard similar stories from other veterans, but experiencing them firsthand in such circumstances made the tragedy more immediate and personal. "Sergeant, I want to help you," Morrison said, his voice softening. "But sitting in the Queen's Rose Garden with a loaded weapon isn't going to bring your family back or save your house. It's only going to make your problems worse." "At least people are paying attention now," Daniel replied. "For the first time in months, someone is actually listening to what I have to say." Morrison realized that the intrusion itself was a cry for help rather than a genuine threat. Daniel Morrison wasn't a terrorist or an assassin. He was a broken soldier who had run out of options and resorted to desperate measures to get someone in authority to acknowledge his existence. "You're right about that," Morrison admitted. "You definitely have everyone's attention. The question is, what do you want to do with it?" Daniel considered the question carefully. His original plan had been vague: get inside the palace demand, to speak with someone who understood military service and somehow force the system to address his problems. Now that he was here, the reality of his situation became clearer. He was surrounded by armed officers, trespassing on royal property, and facing serious criminal charges regardless of his motivations. "I want someone to review my disability claim fairly," Daniel said after a long pause. "I want help finding resources to keep my house and maybe get my family back. I want to be treated like a human being instead of just another file number." "Those are reasonable requests," Morrison responded. "But this isn't the way to achieve them. You know that, don't you?" Daniel nodded slowly, the weight of his actions beginning to sink in. "I know, but I've tried everything else, Inspector. I've filled out forms, attended meetings, called government offices, and met with officials. Nothing worked. They just kept telling me to wait to be patient, to trust the system. Morrison understood the desperation that had led to this moment. He had seen too many good soldiers broken by bureaucratic indifference and systematic failures in veteran support services. The tragedy was that Daniel Morrison's problems were solvable with proper intervention and resources. "Sergeant, I'm going to make you a promise," Morrison said, moving even closer to the bench. "If you surrender your weapon peacefully and come with me, I will personally ensure that your case gets reviewed by the right people. I know officers in veteran affairs who can cut through the red tape." "You'd do that?" Daniel asked, surprised. "By the offer. I'd do that because it's the right thing to do and because I understand what you're going through. But I need you to trust me and surrender that weapon." Daniel looked down at his service pistol, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavier than ever before. The weapon represented his military identity, his training, and his ability to protect himself. Giving it up meant becoming vulnerable in a way that terrified him. "If I surrender, what happens to me?" Daniel asked. "You'll be arrested and charged with trespassing and weapons violations," Morrison answered honestly. "But given your military service and the circumstances, I'll recommend that you receive psychiatric evaluation and treatment rather than prison." The honesty was appreciated, but the prospect of arrest still frightened Daniel. His military record had been spotless. Criminal charges would destroy any remaining chances of rebuilding his life and career. "Inspector, I need you to understand something," Daniel said, looking directly at Morrison for the first time. "I'm not crazy, and I'm not a criminal. Just a soldier who gave everything for his country and got abandoned when I needed help. I do understand, Sergeant, and I believe there are people who want to help you, but this situation has to end peacefully first." Daniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of roses that surrounded him. When he opened them again, he reached slowly for his weapon, moving with deliberate care to avoid triggering a violent response from the officers around him. The moment Daniel Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon, every security officer in the Rose Garden tensed. Sniper rifles tracked his movements, armed response teams adjusted their positions, and radio chatter increased as commanders prepared for multiple scenarios. Inspector Morrison held up his hand, signaling the other officers to hold their positions while Daniel slowly, deliberately removed his service pistol from its holster. "Nice and easy, Sergeant," Morrison said, his voice steady despite the tension that filled the garden. "Just place it on the ground beside the bench and step away." Daniel's hand shook slightly as he held his weapon, not from fear, but from the emotional weight of surrendering the last symbol of his military identity. The pistol had been with him through 3 tours of duty, had saved his life and the lives of his fellow soldiers. Placing it on the ground felt like giving up a part of his soul. "This weapon saved 12 lives in Helmand Province," Daniel said, quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "It protected my unit during an ambush that should have killed us all." "I understand, Sergeant," Morrison replied. "Your weapon has an honorable history, just like you do. But right now, it's preventing us from helping you." With careful movements that demonstrated his military training, even in surrender, Daniel placed the pistol on the marble path beside the bench and stepped backward with his hands raised. The collective exhale from the security team was almost audible as the immediate threat was neutralized. "Armed response teams, move in and secure the weapon," Morrison commanded through his radio. "Medical team, stand by for evaluation." Seconds, officers in tactical gear approached from multiple directions, their movements coordinated and professional. Daniel remained motionless with his hands raised, showing the discipline that had been drilled into him during years of military service. "Sergeant Morrison, I need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back," one of the tactical officers instructed. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Daniel felt the full reality of his situation settling in. He was now a criminal, arrested on the grounds of Buckingham Palace, facing charges that could destroy any remaining hope of rebuilding his life. The desperate gamble had failed, and his problems had only become worse. "You did the right thing, Sergeant," Inspector Morrison said, as the tactical team began leading Daniel away. "I meant what I said about helping you. This isn't over." The procession through the palace grounds was surreal for Daniel. He had spent months fantasizing about getting inside these historic walls, but not like this. Gardens that had hosted centuries of royal events, corridors where kings and queens had walked, rooms where decisions affecting millions of people had been made, all of it passed by in a blur as he was escorted toward the outside world. News crews had gathered outside the palace gates. Having picked up reports of the security incident through police scanners and social media, camera flashes exploded as Daniel was led toward a waiting police van, his military uniform making him easily identifiable as the intruder who had somehow penetrated one of the most secure locations in Britain. Sergeant Morrison.
What were you
Trying to accomplish? Shouted one reporter. Were you planning to harm the royal family? Called another dot. Daniel kept his head down, saying nothing as he was placed in the police van. The media attention he had unconsciously sought was now focused on him, but not in any way that would help his cause. Instead of being seen as a veteran in need of assistance, he would be portrayed as a dangerous criminal who had threatened national security. The ride to the police station passed in silence. Daniel stared out the window at London streets. He had walked as a free man just hours earlier, wondering if he would ever walk them freely again. His actions had guaranteed media attention, but they had also guaranteed criminal prosecution and public humiliation. At the police station, Daniel was processed through the standard procedures for arrested individuals: fingerprints, photographs, property inventory, medical screening, all conducted with professional efficiency by officers who treated him no differently than any other suspect. You have the right to legal representation, the custody officer informed him as he was placed in a holding cell. Is there someone you'd like us to contact? Daniel almost laughed at the question. His wife had left him, his parents lived in Scotland and barely spoke to him anymore, and his closest friends were soldiers deployed overseas. There was literally no one in his life who could help him navigate this situation. No, he said simply, "There's no one." The holding cell was small, clean, and utterly depressing. Daniel sat on the narrow bench and tried to process the events of the day. His desperate plan had accomplished nothing except making his problems infinitely worse. Instead of getting help with his disability claim, he now faced serious criminal charges. Instead of saving his house, he had guaranteed that he would lose it. Instead of reuniting with his family, he had made himself unemployable and unmarriageable. Hours passed before Inspector Morrison appeared at the cell door, accompanied by a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Collins, a psychiatrist who worked with military veterans. "Sergeant Morrison," Dr. Collins said, her voice gentle but professional. "Inspector Morrison has told me about your situation. I'd like to talk with you about what led to today's events." "What's the point?" Daniel asked, not bothering to look up from the floor. "I've destroyed my life. Nothing you say is going to change that." "Maybe not," Dr. Collins admitted, but understanding. Why this happened might help prevent it from happening to other veterans in similar situations. The honesty in her response surprised Daniel. He had expected empty reassurances and false promises, not acknowledgement that his situation might be beyond repair. "Inspector Morrison has been in contact with some colleagues in Veteran Affairs," Dr. Collins continued. "Your case has generated attention at high levels of government. Sometimes it takes a dramatic incident to expose systemic problems." Daniel finally looked up, seeing genuine concern in both visitors' faces. "Are you saying that my stupidity might actually help other veterans?" "Your desperation," Inspector Morrison corrected. "You reached a breaking point and took dramatic action to get attention for legitimate problems. That's not stupidity. That's the action of someone who had run out of options." For the first time since his arrest, Daniel felt a spark of something that might have been hope. Perhaps his sacrifice of freedom and reputation might serve some greater purpose, might prevent other veterans from reaching the same desperate point. "There's something else," Dr. Collins said. "Your story has resonated with people who understand military service. We've received offers of legal assistance, housing support, and job placement help. The public attention you feared might actually work in your favor." Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. The media attention he had dreaded is humiliating. Exposure might actually bring the help he desperately needed. The criminal charges were still serious, but perhaps there was hope for rebuilding his life after serving whatever sentence awaited him. 3 weeks after his arrest at Buckingham Palace, Daniel Morrison sat in a courtroom that was packed with supporters he had never expected to have. Military veterans filled the gallery, many wearing their service medals and dress uniforms too, shows solidarity with a fellow soldier who had reached his breaking point. The media attention that had initially terrified him had transformed into something. It's entirely different. A national conversation about how Britain treated its military veterans. His legal representative, Sarah Thompson, was a prominent human rights. A lawyer who had taken his case without charge after being contacted by veteran advocacy groups. She had spent weeks building a defense that focused not on denying his actions, but on explaining the circumstances that had led to them. Your Honor, Thompson addressed the judge. My client stands before you not as a criminal, but as a victim of systematic failures in our veteran support system. Sergeant Morrison served his country with distinction for 12 years, completing 5 combat deployments and earning commendations for bravery under fire. Judge Margaret Henley listened intently as Thompson outlined Daniel's military service record, his struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder, and the bureaucratic obstacles that had denied him the support he had earned through his service. The judge's own son had served in Afghanistan, giving her personal insight into the challenges facing returning veterans. Sergeant Morrison's actions on October 15th were clearly illegal, Thompson continued. He trespassed on royal property, carried weapons without authorization, and caused a significant security incident. We do not dispute these facts. However, we ask the court to consider the extraordinary circumstances that led to these desperate actions. Daniel watched from the defendant's chair as his lawyer painted a picture of systematic neglect and institutional indifference that had driven him to his breaking point. Part of him felt embarrassed to have his personal struggles aired in such a public forum. But another part felt vindicated that someone was finally acknowledging the injustices he had faced. The prosecution, represented by Crown Prosecutor James Mitchell, acknowledged the mitigating circumstances while emphasizing the seriousness of Daniel's actions. While we sympathize with Sergeant Morrison's personal difficulties, Mitchell argued, we cannot ignore the fact that he penetrated security at one of Britain's most important national landmarks while armed with a loaded weapon. The potential for tragedy was enormous, regardless of his stated intentions. Inspector Morrison was called as a witness, testifying about his interaction with Daniel in the Rose Garden and his assessment of the situation. Sergeant Morrison was clearly in distress, the inspector told the court. His actions were those of a desperate man seeking attention for legitimate grievances, not those of someone intending to cause harm. In my professional opinion, he posed a minimal threat to public safety. The testimony that had the greatest impact came from Dr. Collins, the psychiatrist who had evaluated Daniel after his arrest. Her assessment revealed the depth of his psychological trauma and the inadequacy of support services available to veterans like him. Sergeant Morrison suffers from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by depression and anxiety related to his personal and financial circumstances, Dr. Collins explained to the court. His actions at Buckingham Palace represent a cry for help from someone who had exhausted all conventional avenues for assistance. Daniel's former commanding officer, Colonel William Hayes, had traveled from his current posting in Germany to testify on behalf of his former subordinate. Sergeant Morrison was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command, Colonel Hayes told the court. He saved lives, completed impossible missions, and demonstrated courage under fire that earned the respect of everyone who served with him. If the system had worked properly, we wouldn't be here today. The most emotional moment came when Daniel was given the opportunity to address the court directly. He had prepared remarks with his lawyer's help, but when he stood to speak, he found himself setting aside his prepared statement and speaking from his heart. Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong, Daniel began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I trespassed on royal property, caused a security incident, and frightened people who were just doing their jobs. There's no excuse for that, and I accept full responsibility for my actions. He paused, looking around the courtroom at the faces of supporters who had rallied to his cause. But I also want the court to understand that I didn't wake up one morning and decide to break into Buckingham Palace. I was driven to that point by a system that failed me at every turn, despite my 12 years of faithful service to this country." Daniel's voice began to crack with emotion as he continued. "I lost my family because I couldn't get the mental health support I needed. I lost my home because my disability claim was denied. I felt invisible, forgotten, cast aside like a broken tool that had outlived its usefulness. Breaking into the palace wasn't about harming anyone. It was about making someone, anyone, acknowledge that I existed and that I mattered." The courtroom was completely silent as Daniel finished his statement and returned to his seat. Judge Henley took several minutes to review her notes before announcing her decision. "Sergeant Morrison, your actions on October 15th were serious crimes that could have had tragic consequences," the judge began. "However, this court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances that led to those actions and the systematic failures that contributed to your desperate state of mind." Daniel held his breath, knowing that his future depended on the next few sentences. "Taking into account your exemplary military service, your clean criminal record, your cooperation with authorities, and the clear evidence that you pose no ongoing threat to public safety, this court sentences you to 18 months in prison, suspended for 2 years. Contingent upon your participation in mandatory psychiatric treatment and community service." The relief that washed over Daniel was overwhelming. A suspended sentence meant he would remain free as long as he met the court's conditions, giving him the opportunity to rebuild his life with the support that was finally being offered. Judge Henley continued, addressing not just Daniel, but the broader issues his case had revealed. "This case has highlighted serious deficiencies in how we support military veterans who have served our country with honor. Sergeant Morrison's desperation should serve as a wake-up call for all institutions responsible for veteran welfare." Court adjourned. Daniel was surrounded by supporters offering assistance, employment opportunities, and housing options. The media attention that had begun as a humiliating exposure of his failures had transformed into a platform for positive change that extended far beyond his individual circumstances. Inspector Morrison approached him as the courtroom began to empty. "Sergeant, I told you I'd help review your disability claim," the inspector said. "Well, it's been expedited and approved. You should receive your first payment within 2 weeks." Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. The bureaucratic obstacles that had seemed insurmountable just weeks earlier were crumbling in the face of public attention and institutional embarrassment. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice filled with gratitude, "for everything." "Don't thank me," Morrison replied. "Thank the people who refused to let your story be forgotten. Your courage in that rose garden changed more than just your own life." As Daniel walked out of the courthouse, he was met by a crowd of veterans and their families who had gathered to show support. Many had their own stories of bureaucratic struggles and systematic neglect, but Daniel's dramatic action had given voice to their collective frustration and sparked real changes in government policy. Sarah Thompson, his lawyer, walked beside him as they navigated through the crowd of supporters and media representatives. "Daniel, there are several organizations that want to offer you employment opportunities," she said, handing him a folder filled with business cards and contact information. "Your military experience and the leadership you've shown through this ordeal have impressed a lot of people." Among the offers was one that particularly caught Daniel's attention, a position with a veteran advocacy organization that had been formed specifically in response to his case. They wanted him to help other struggling veterans navigate the system that had nearly destroyed him. "It could help prevent other soldiers from reaching the same desperate point you reached," Thompson explained. "Your experience gives you credibility that policymakers and bureaucrats can't ignore." Daniel looked back at the courthouse where his fate had been decided, then forward toward a future that suddenly seemed filled with possibilities he had never imagined. The desperate gamble that had seemed like the end of his life might actually be the beginning of something much more meaningful. 3 hours later, Daniel found himself in an unexpected place, back at Buckingham Palace, but this time as an invited guest rather than an intruder. Colonel Hayes had arranged a meeting between Daniel and Guardsman Fletcher, the Royal Guard, who had first observed him outside the palace gates weeks earlier. They met in a small office within the palace complex, away from the tourist areas and media attention. Fletcher, dressed in civilian clothes rather than his ceremonial uniform, shook Daniel's hand with genuine warmth. Sergeant Morrison, I want you to know that your actions that day made all of us think differently about what we're protecting here," Fletcher said. "We're not just guarding buildings and traditions, we're protecting the values that make this country worth serving." "I'm sorry for putting you and your colleagues in such a difficult position," Daniel replied. "No, you were just doing your jobs." Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. "We were doing our jobs, but your situation made us realize that our job includes looking out for fellow soldiers, even when they're not wearing the same uniform." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Daniel had expected. Fletcher and several other palace guards had been quietly working with veteran advocacy groups, using their unique position to bring attention to issues facing military personnel and their families. "Your case became a catalyst for changes that were already beginning," Fletcher explained. "But it took your dramatic action to force people in power to pay attention and take action." Daniel learned that his breach of palace security had led to comprehensive reviews, not just of physical security measures, but of the support systems available to military veterans who might pose similar risks. Mental health resources had been expanded, bureaucratic processes streamlined, and new protocols established for identifying and assisting struggling former service members. 6 months after his dramatic intrusion into Buckingham Palace, Daniel Morrison stood before a packed auditorium at the Royal Military Academy, addressing an audience of current serving officers, veterans, and government officials. The man who had once felt invisible and forgotten was now a recognized voice in the movement to reform veteran support services across Britain. "Ladies and gentlemen, 6 months ago, I made the worst decision of my life," Daniel began, his voice carrying clearly through the large hall. "I broke into Buckingham Palace because I felt that no one was listening to the struggles of military veterans like myself." The audience listened intently as Daniel recounted his journey from desperation to hope, from criminal to advocate. His story had become a powerful tool for highlighting systematic problems that affected thousands of veterans across the country. "I was wrong to think that breaking the law was my only option," he continued. "But I was right to believe that our veteran support system was broken and needed fixing." In the months since his court appearance, Daniel had become the face of veteran advocacy in Britain. The media attention that had initially embarrassed him had transformed into a platform for positive change that extended far beyond his individual circumstances. His disability claim had not only been approved, but expedited, providing him with the financial stability he had desperately needed. More importantly, his case had prompted a complete review of the disability assessment process, resulting in policy changes that would help thousands of other veterans receive the support they had earned through their service. The house that he had been on the verge of losing was now secure, thanks to both his disability payments and a new job with the Veterans Support Foundation, an organization that had been established specifically to address the issues his case had revealed. But the most meaningful change in Daniel's life was the gradual rebuilding of his relationship with his daughter Emma. His ex-wife had been initially horrified by the media attention surrounding his arrest. But as the public narrative shifted from criminal to advocate, she began to see him in a different light. "Daddy, are you famous now?" Emma had asked during their first supervised visit after the court case. "Not famous, sweetheart," Daniel had replied. "Just trying to help other soldiers who were having troubles like Daddy." Their relationship was still fragile. But Emma's mother had agreed to regular visits and was considering the possibility of reconciliation once Daniel had proven his stability in his new role. After his speech at the military academy, Daniel was approached by Guardsman Fletcher, who had become an unexpected ally in his advocacy work. Fletcher had used his position within the palace system to champion veteran causes from the inside, creating a bridge between ceremonial tradition and practical reform. "Excellent speech, Sergeant," Fletcher said, extending his hand. "You've come a long way from that desperate man I first noticed outside the palace gates." "We both have," Daniel replied, thinking about how their lives had become intertwined through that fateful encounter. "Your support has meant more than you know." Fletcher had indeed become more than just a witness to Daniel's story. He had testified before parliamentary committees about the need for better mental health support for military personnel, using his experience as a royal guard to give weight to arguments for systematic reform. Together, they had developed training programs that helped identify warning signs of veteran distress and connect struggling former service members with appropriate resources before they reached crisis points. The program had already prevented several potential incidents similar to Daniel's palace intrusion. "There's something I want to show you," Fletcher said, leading Daniel toward a quieter corner of the academy building. "It arrived this morning." Handed Daniel an official-looking document bearing the royal seal. As Daniel read the contents, his eyes widened with surprise and emotion. "Her Majesty has decided to award you the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service," Fletcher explained. "In recognition of your exceptional contribution to veteran welfare and your service to the community." Daniel could hardly believe what he was reading. 6 months earlier, he had been arrested on royal property as a criminal intruder. Now he was being honored by the same institution for his service to fellow veterans. "This is incredible, Daniel," said, his voice filled with wonder. "How did this happen?" "Your work speaks for itself," Fletcher replied. "The Veteran Support Foundation you helped establish has assisted over 3,000 former service members in just 6 months. The policy changes your case prompted have improved the lives of countless others." The award ceremony was scheduled for the following month, and Daniel would be invited back to Buckingham Palace, this time as an honored guest rather than an unwelcome intruder. The symmetry was not lost on either man. As the evening wound down, Daniel found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this point. The darkest moment of his life had somehow transformed into its most meaningful chapter, creating opportunities to help others that he could never have imagined. His phone buzzed with a text message from his ex-wife. "Saw your speech on the news. Emma is very proud of her daddy. So am I. Can we talk about the future?" Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been absent for so long. The family that had been torn apart by his struggles was showing signs of healing, just as his own life was being rebuilt on a foundation of purpose and service to others. Later that night, Daniel stood in his small apartment, looking at a framed photograph that sat on his desk, showed him with a group of veterans he had helped through the support foundation, all of them smiling and confident in ways they hadn't been when they first sought assistance. Next to it was another photograph. Emma on their most recent visit, wearing a bright smile as she held up a drawing she had made of her daddy helping other soldiers. The innocence and pride in her young face reminded Daniel of why his work mattered so much. His laptop was open to an email from Inspector Morrison, who had stayed in touch throughout Daniel's transformation. The message contained information about 3 more veterans who needed assistance, along with an invitation to speak at a European conference on military mental health. The man who had once felt invisible and forgotten was now making a difference on an international stage, using his experience and hard-won wisdom to prevent other soldiers from reaching the same desperate point he had reached. As Daniel prepared for bed, he thought about the rose garden at Buckingham Palace, where his life had changed forever. In that moment of surrender, when he had placed his weapon on the marble path and stepped away, he had unknowingly taken the first step toward a future he could never have imagined. The rogue soldier who had invaded Buckingham Palace in desperation had become an advocate whose work was changing lives across Britain and beyond. His story proved that even the darkest moments could become sources of light for others, and that sometimes the most dramatic mistakes could lead to the most meaningful victories.